Welcome everyone, wherever you are in the world. Today is Thursday, February the 18th, and we are in the 14th day of the big read of Solving the Race Issue in America. And we're praying for everyone out there. We know that in several parts of our country, there's energy out and excessive rain and tornadoes hitting and all of that stuff. So wherever you are in the world, we're praying for you and your family. We're being joined today, of course, by our author, H.J. Harris, who's written the book, Solving the Race Issue in America, and has made himself available for discussion. Good morning, Dr. Harris. We're also being joined by our two readers today, two beautiful women. We have our first reader, Ms. Danica David, who is rejoining us. We had her photo up the last time she read with us, but now we get to see her live and direct, surrounded by beautiful art. Welcome, Danica David. So glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And our second, yes, you want to say something?
Oh, I'm very thankful for being here. Thank you for inviting me. I am honored.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. And our second reader, oh, she'll be back. She's here with us. Is she still? Can you see her? I can't see her on my screen. Mrs. Tammy Hunt. Can't hear you, Dr. Harris.
Yes, Miss Tammy Hunt, Tam E. Hunt, and she's coming right back on with us. There we go.
Excellent, absolutely. So we will begin with Dr. Harris. He can give us an over. Oh, welcome, Miss Tammy Hunt. We're so glad to have you here with us today reading.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. And so we can start with Dr. Harris, kind
Well,
of bringing us up to speed. And remember, the timekeeper is I, and these are 15-minute kind of old school hourglasses. And so we're here for an hour. We're going to ask the speakers when we're not speaking to just put ourselves on mute like this, and then we'll go directly to Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris.
well, one, thank you everybody for being here today. This has been an incredible, this is day 14 of being as close to heaven as you might get without dying. So what we've done over these last 14 days, folks, and I want to really thank our audience. We have had an audience, when we say international, we've had an audience from virtually around the world, and people who are concerned about what it takes, and I'm going to say it in a profound way, what it takes to save America. The spirit of America right now is in jeopardy because of things that have been done in our country by our countrymen to each other, among each other. But all is not lost. We are in a position now that we can solve the race issue once and for all, but it's going to take three things: acknowledgement, forgiveness, and atonement. So just let those hang out there for a while. Over these last 14 days, we have really gone from why the book was written, the idea that when we saw the political landscape change from when President Obama was elected, I truly thought that the race issue was resolved because it takes white and black people working together to elect the president of this country. That is the cornerstone of our democracy. And so once President-elect Obama was elected, I thought for sure that the issue of racism had been resolved. But what we found was immediately after his election, this mantra developed of taking our country back. And it really was interesting, taking our country back is an interesting concept because I didn't know someone had taken our country, but that was a mindset. Then follow that in 2016 with the idea of Make America Great Again, almost as though because of the Obama years, America was no longer great. That prompted us to write the book, Solving the Race Issue in America, to help give America and Americans a pathway to resolve this cancer that has been living on the soul of America for 400 years. Back to you, Doc.
Excellent. So we're going to ask our first reader, Danita David, to read. And I'm going to ask, will our panelists, our reader, Mrs. Hunt, could you kindly put yourself on mute while Miss
Oh, I can do
David
that.
reads?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. It's okay.
Fantastic. Hold on.
Great.
Sorry about that.
No problem. There's a button there. It should be your bottom left corner.
I know I keep going.
Okay. So we'll start with you, Miss David. Thank you for joining us, and please begin our reading at where we left off last time, which is, for those of you with a hard book, we're on page 90, and in the ebook, it's the page right before chapter 7. Okay. Thank you so much. Miss David.
Slavery, an experiment in behavior modification. What if we look at this 100th monkey phenomenon and apply it to the training, conditioning, and treatment of the slaves, Black Americans in America, particularly during the 300 years or so up to the end of the Civil War in 1865. During this period of absolute slavery in which Africans were kidnapped from their homeland and enslaved by some Christian white people, there was a systemic program of behavior modification designed to transform a Black human being into an inhuman parcel of property, a Black American slave. The training of a slave is very similar to the training of the mice and the experiments of McDougall, Crewe, and Agar. Slaves were basically put into water maze, a controlled environment, America. Slaves were trained to develop and demonstrate behaviors that were pleasant to their masters. The education process was basically the same for mice and slaves. Certain behaviors resulted in pain and even death, while other behaviors, those desired by the master, did not. The difference between mice and men, the American slaves. In these comparable experiments is that men are infinitely more complex. The impact of the slavery experience must be examined on other levels than simple behaviors patterns. The behavior modification experiments of McDougall, Crewe, and Agar dealt with physical behavior patterns. Let us consider the emotional and psychological patterns of thought, behavior, and psyche, an outlook on life impacted by the slave-making process. We should find that the emotional and psychological aspects of being enslaved are transferred from generation to generation with an enslaved species as a whole, regardless of whether the particular Black American was personally subjected to the slave-making process.
Now, before she goes, I'd like to just sort of tie us in. The first part, and thank you so much, Danica. That was beautiful. You know, as you read it, it comes to life for me again. And this section is referring to the chapter in the book called The 100th Monkey. And this is a series of experiments. McDougall and Crewe and Agar were psychologists at Harvard and England and in Australia that did experiments with behavior modification of mice, showing how certain behaviors could be encouraged by pain or pleasure. If a mouse did one thing, they got hurt or killed. If a mouse did another thing, they got rewarded. And to show this as a very powerful pain reward process for teaching people to demonstrate certain activities. This is just a very, if the slave process is a basketball, a three-dimensional object, this idea of behavior modification is like a circle. If you shine a light on that basketball, you'll see a circle on the floor. So it's just a circle. It's just a very finite representation of the process. And with people, it's much more complex. But the idea is that was a basic part of it. And it goes on from there. So we'll go back to our reader as we go to chapter 7, The Making of a Slave. Go right on, Danica.
Chapter 7, The Making of a Slave. It is well documented that white men had developed a training process that utilized physical and psychological punishment, torture, threats, and intimidation to destroy the humanity of these and kidnapped Africans. This sadistic behavior modification experience was designed to transform the kidnapped Africans into that which was pleasing and beneficial to the white Christian masters, the Black American slave. The training process of creating a slave is the same process by which rats were trained in the aforementioned laboratory experiments. The only difference is that the behavior modification process of creating a slave was not an experiment. It was an experience, a very real experience conducted and perpetuated for more than 400 years. Since the lifespan of a slave, due to the harsh conditions of life inflicted upon them by their masters, was undoubtedly short. 25 years is reasonably as a generation. Thus, Black Americans endured the direct slave experience for at least 16 generations. Applying the 100th monkey phenomenon to the slave-making experience. Stage 1, the capture. The first African slaves arrived in America in 1619 at Jamestown, Virginia. The slave education had already begun. From the moment they were captured, the kidnapped Africans were intimidated, threatened, beaten, and even killed to motivate them to change their behavior from whatever it was that of a slave. They were placed in chains, strung together, and marched across the body of Africa to the sea in waiting slave ships. The behaviors sought by the slave hunter were total submission, hopelessness, and helplessness. The goal of the slave hunter was to break the spirit of these kidnapped Africans and condition them for the greatest behavior modification experience the world has ever known. Stage 2, the cage. Europeans engaged in the slave trade built great slave castles such as Limna Castle, built in 1482 by the Portuguese on the coast of what is now Ghana. The purpose of these castles was to control the territory and serve as a great holding pens for the kidnapped Africans, awaiting ships to transport them to the Americas. The opening scenes in Harold Burma's film Sankofa gives a vivid picture of the slave dungeons and treatment experienced by these kidnapped Africans. In these castles and fortresses by the sea, kidnapped Africans were herded into cages and branded like cattle with white hot branding irons that burned their flesh and made it bubble, burn, and smell in that distinctive odor of death. African women were raped and abused in every way that thieves, murderers, and convicts would conceive. This was the second level of the kidnapped Africans' condition and behavior, modification toward becoming a slave in America.
Your response to that, Dr. Harris, to the reading? Have you on mute? We can't hear you. You know, Dr. Harris,
Yeah.
okay. I just like to say, because this part, preparing for today, kind of kept me up late last night. And I know it's a rough ride. You know, this is very, for sensitive people particularly, this is very problematic information. And I know that we have to kind of go through this valley. I just like for us to take a moment to talk about, you know, life in Africa prior to engagement with Europeans. And then on the continent of Africa, you know, there were families living collectively, there were communal support of the children, there were systems of governance that were in place. We call them clans, but there was a way of life that existed prior to engagement with Europeans. And we know that, you know, the Africans were fully human and were only treated as inhuman by the Europeans they interacted with. And I just want to say that because we hear, you know, quite a bit that our history did not begin in slavery, and it didn't. But even as we must discuss, or we choose to discuss enslavement, it makes sense to always keep it to the fore that we were living a quality of life prior to the engagement with Europeans.
Absolutely, Doc. And, you know, one of the great treasures, one of the great benefits of travel was a period when I went to study in Egypt with Dr. Ben Yohanan. And when one of the things that amazed me as a Black man, pretty well educated, it was still startling to go into the pyramids, to go into the various temples in Egypt and see figures of Black people up there, clearly African peoples up there. And so it brought back that realization that Egypt was in Africa and that there had been trade between the Egyptians and all of the Southern Africans for thousands of years. And so the Black experience did not start with slavery. And, you know, the master, the slave paradigm, Black people may be afflicted with the slave paradigm, but white people are afflicted with the slave master paradigm, which are two competing but supporting paradigms. The slave master paradigm defining a Black person as a slave, as inhuman, as below any level that demanded respect and treatment in a Christian manner, in a religious manner, in a humane manner. And so this passage was to give people an idea of this transformation from people who were living in a free world, who had families, who had been doing what they've been doing for thousands of years. When you go back, one of the first human beings was found in Africa. Lucy was what, over 3 million years old. So this is our true history. Everything else is a diversion. So this was to show that transformation from what they were to being captured in this gradual process of transforming a human being who was free and living a life of its own in on another continent to a slave picking cotton and being treated inhumanely in America. And so these segments shows that process, and each one was another step to becoming the slave that became the Black man in America. Back to you, Doc.
Thank you for that. And Ms. David, you read the text. What are your thoughts on both your reading as well as, of course, an engagement with Dr. Harris on his comments on the text?
I believe that this text really illustrated, Dr. Harris, I think you did a good job illustrating the pain that they went through. And just in the words, when they were casted with the iron and the bubbling, the burning, that just kind of brought like a eerie feeling to me. But like you mentioned, I never really hear about what life was like before they came to America, and that, you know, they were living and thriving and prospering in their communities before they were captured and taken to become slaves. So I appreciate that you added those steps, because it really put into perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll continue with the reading. Of course, we'll have even more discussion. And now we'll go to our reader, Mrs. Tammy E. Hunt, and we'll start there at stage 3, the ship. Ms. Hunt, if you'd be so kind. And just take a moment and unmute yourself, please.
You have to unmute yourself, Tammy. You're still muted. We can't hear you.
You're still muted, Mrs. Hunt. Ms. Hunt, can you hear us? You're still muted. We can't hear you.
I'm unmuting.
Perfect. There you go.
I had to spread out.
Welcome.
I had to, okay, thank you very much. And Miss David, you read beautifully. After being held in dungeons, cells, and cages of the great slave castles, the kidnapped Africans were herded on ships bound from America. On slave ships, the humanity of the kidnapped Africans was further degraded by being stuffed naked into the cargo holds, shackled with chains on their wrists and their ankles, bound one to another in spaces so tight that they could do nothing but lie in their own waste. Stage 4, Mount Misery. Once the kidnapped Africans arrived in America, they were given over to slave trainers to receive their final educations, conditioning, training, and behavior modification. It was at the Mount Miseries of America that the slave learned to submit or die. Here the slave learned to be totally reliant on the master. Here the slave learned he could not think, read, or write. Here the slave learned to fear the master and totally submit. Reasoning analogously with the 100th monkey phenomena, there would come a time when a finite number of kidnapped Africans had learned the behavior of a slave. At some point, all kidnapped Africans who then became the slaves of America would demonstrate the same slave behaviors, thoughts, and habits. Page 96, stage 5, perpetuating slavery. Just as with the experiment where rats were taught a particular behavior, Black Americans thought the slavery process were taught and learned the behaviors and mindset of a slave. This slave mindset and behavior patterns affected and afflicted not only the kidnapped Africans who experienced the brutality of the slave making process, but also affected and inflicted virtually every Black American in the United States, creating a slave behavior and a slave mentality in Black Americans was the problem Americans who created and to this day control this country. We were reminded of the words of Reverend C.T. Blackwell, the Christian minister of First Baptist Church in Wilmington, North Carolina, after the violence and brutality coup 1890. There will be lasting and wholesome mental respect between the races based on a right understanding. A change of manners on the street is already observable. It will leave a lasting good on the minds of the Negro children. They had never seen in all their lives any strong hand holding a rod of chastisement that had had least fear of or respect for until Thursday and Friday. They looked upon the rapid fire guns and Winchesters in the hands of determined, masterful white men whom they met every day on the streets and whom they meet in the future to respect. It struck terror in their hearts. It put new thoughts into their woolly heads. It took out of their minds a quantity of that false teaching they had received from the record and other sources, and from the few white men who have used their parents to secure office. These children have seen and in a sense felt rod, which when spared too long is as apt to spoil childish race as an individual child of any. Reverend Blackwell was affirming that the goal of white Americans through the carefully planned, consciously inflicted use of force, fear, and intimidation was to create a certain mindset and behaviors that were pleasing and acceptable to white America. That mindset and behavior created by white America was the mindset and behavior of a slave. Based on the application of the 100 monkey phenomenon, virtually all Black Americans have, to some degree, a slave mindset and congruent slave behaviors. The creation of a slave by white Americans was as carefully and purposefully designed and meticulously implemented as any behavior modification experiment ever conducted. A detailed treatment of the slave making process was outlined in the famous speech of Willie Lynch, delivered to Virginia slave owners in 1712. According to an essay appearing in Brother Man, The Odyssey of Black Men in America, an anthology, Willie Lynch was a British slave owner from the West Indies who came to the United States to tell American slave owners how to keep their slaves under control. The term lynching is alleged to be derived from Willie Lynch's name. Minister Louis Farrakhan quoted from Willie Lynch's speech at the Million Man March, where it stunned the audience because of the cold-blooded way it described how the minds of African Americans can be enslaved.
Wow, Miss Tammy, thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
You know, when we were writing that passage, it was so emotionally draining to put myself in their picture, put myself in their position, and to feel as they felt. You know, there's a proverb, I think it's an Indian proverb, and it says, "Don't judge a man until you walk a mile in his moccasins." And so when we were writing that, and as I listened to it being read, that Mount Misery, that institution of higher slave learning. In North Carolina, there is a road, Mount Misery still exists, the physical plant of a Mount Misery, and it's still called Mount Misery. And one of the things about it is we were taught that the road to Mount Misery was called, and I'll use the proper Inward Head Road. The reason was when the slaves were brought from the ships for their final training, Inward Head Road, the road to Mount Misery, was bounded by stakes with heads of dead slaves on them. And the smell, if you've ever smelled it, made the smell of death, the smell in that scene, the whole idea was to create such a level of fear that that fear would forever dictate how that slave would act, that slave would never rebel, that the fear was so great that there would never be a time that that slave would go up against the master. And now, once that road was traversed and you got to the Mount Misery, which was an actual camp, the grounds are still there. It's interesting, they've been bought. It eventually became a kind of it's right by the river. But it was at that camp that final training, that total brutalization of a human being, so that the end result was a totally dehumanized, completely controlled human being who did only what they were told and nothing else. Doc, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think about resistance. I think about, the Africans who threw themselves from the ship rather than to be enslaved. I think about one of our speakers said, until the lion writes the story, the hunter will always win. So I think of all of the acts of resistance where the kidnapped African who would not die actually brought death to others during the process of the enslavement process, and how those stories have not been told. I think of the fact that the Africans who came to America were not tabula rasa. They came with knowledge of horticulture, of agriculture. And in fact, they planted foods and crafted foods in a manner that sustained life here in the United States. And I think of the ingenuity of the Africans when, for example, the women would quilt quilts that would use symbols to point toward freedom, or that would tell a story to those who were seeking freedom in the midst of the enslavement process. And then lastly, for me, Dr. Harris, just like we talk about the paradigm of slavery, I think about the paradigm of the enslavers, of the slave makers. Quite a bit of Europeans, truth be told, were released from prisons in Europe and sent to America as punishment. And so that criminal mind, that criminal behavior toward the treatment of fellow human beings is what I'm hearing. But I'm also hearing that you make a very interesting statement that virtually everyone has a slave mentality in some shape, form, or fashion. And that hit my ear real funny. And I thought about it. Well, if we reverse that coin, does that mean that every European has within them the savagery of the slave maker? That those remnants exist as well. That mentality, that brute force mentality, will at some point come out, which is why so many people were silent when the man put his knee on George Floyd. Because if that mentality exists within that community, then that comes out ultimately in silence around so many other Black folks being killed and shot, etc. So that's what I think of. I think of, yes, the victimization of a people, but I think of the victimizers, and I wonder if they still maintain the mindset of victimizing other human beings. Those are my thoughts.
Dr. Rogers, may I insert something there? And what it brings to the table for me is just systemic racism, in the root of the systemic racism that exists today, that, we've been beaten into submission, but I think it took a large mind to submit. These people did come well equipped. They were educated in many ways, healing, religiosity, more than religious, spiritual, again, understanding code, which gives us a sense of mathematics and logic, being able to read the symbols, symbology, as it affects us today in every way. Some of the symbology that we see, even in our money, that's one of the first places we can find codes, comes from African influence, whether it's a pyramid it is still the continent of Africa and the influence of the person of melanin. I'm going to use that more than say person of color, the melanin, which affects us again systemically through the brain. I don't know what your discipline is in terms of your PhD, and because I finished my undergrad, not because I'm a lazy girl, but because I'm a smart girl, and I've even experiential learning. But I salute your PhD. I salute Dr. Harris, and both of you as educators and learned men. But I think that what is going on with anybody now, let's say 1400 years, 400 years from ago, being beaten to submission, we've had enough quote unquote freedom to find our way out of that stumbling block. I know that we could be indelibly influenced by those things that have happened to us through our ancestors, and that maybe there's some DNA that could account for behavior. But I think it's time for us to stop blaming and submitting to Willie Lynch and his theories, and any white man that may have whipped a black man in front of my great-great-great-grandmother, grandfather, siblings, or whomever that it is that we're related to. And we all very well may be related to one another because of separatism. So I think that we as a people, and out of this wonderful, wonderful thesis that, or more dissertation that Dr. Harris has written, that we should find a way out of being victims and being victors. And I think it's our time now. And that is not to asparage or discount anything that anyone else is thinking. This is purely what I think in my freedom. I love my Black men, and I love my sisters too. But I got to tell you, I love my men more, because the strength that exists in us as Black women, we go get what we want. And sometimes our Black men have to struggle to get it. Sometimes we have to set our Black men up to get it. But we want our Black men to stop disrespecting us, because the behavior that the Black man is showing through systemic racism toward us, and how they treat us after they achieve what they want and using us as stepping stones, that has to stop. You know, Minister Farrakhan speaks of it all the time, you know, that we have to treasure the Black woman. Black women are turning to one another. I'm not interested in any ladies. But if my Black men take the path to the master's piece of work, then what's left for us? What's left? We have been victimized chemically. There are things in water that causes homosexuality, the hormones that are put in the food, women turn into women, men turn into men. How do we stop that? That's what we've been talking about, what the white man has done to us. What are we going to talk about in terms of how to undo the injustice that we suffer today?
If I can respond, I think that when we look at some of the things that you're talking about, I think that's a continuation of the savage mind in modern times, right?
How
So
do you stop it?
people in hip hop music, for example, talk about how during the golden age of hip hop, quote unquote, when Public Enemy and Wise, Intelligent, and other hip hop artists were saying uplifting things, even using African symbology with the necklaces, etc., that European men got together and said to hip hop artists, we want to put to other executives, we want to put negativity in the music. We want to glorify death and destruction and the what you talked about, the disrespect of Black women. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to feed that message to the children so that years from now we can fill these prisons. And so Amos Wilson, a psychologist, I'm a political scientist, but Amos Wilson's a psychologist, and he talks about when we look at even internalized self-oppression that African Americans go through today, that there's a profit motive in that. And when you get to the bottom of the profit motive, you can get to the root of it. You often see Black men call Black women out of their name. That's a symptom of a deeper problem. But then if it's societally reinforced, I mean, look at Jay-Z. You can argue that he's a billionaire, yes, but look at the language that shows up in every single song he comes up with. He says the N word 3 times in a row, every single song he comes up with. And out of that, he's being rewarded to the tune of $1 billion. And so many of these other people that are being economically rewarded. So it can go as deep as we desire in this conversation, but I'll just refrain and pull back and say, in the context of this work, when I read the effect upon the mind of the enslaved, I also look to the effect upon the mind of the enslaver and the enslaver's ancestors. And when I look at systemic racism today, in my analysis, I see some of that same behavior played out in technology, in the making of movies and film. You talked about in the food and what people are eating and the water, et cetera, et cetera. Flint, Michigan. To me, the treatment of water in Flint, Michigan is as devastating as Dr. Harris talked about Misery Mountain, where you have those poles and you have death all around because everyone needs water. And if you dig deeper into Flint, and I'll stop, the people who were controlling the flow of water in Flint, they sold the good water to water companies and they sent the dirty water to Flint. So there were profits being made off of a natural resource, while at the same time, you're killing off of people intentionally. And then they come back and they say, well, these water companies are going to offer good water to the people in Flint. That's their water to begin with. So I'll stop there and turn it over to either Dr. Harris or Ms. David.
Doc, you know, you made a few points. Thank you so much. And thank you, Tammy. It just the discussion just shows the complexity of it all, that there's so many layers of it. When you were talking about George Floyd, it was interesting to watch the transformation with George Floyd. Initially, the world was repulsed, the world was responding. And over a relatively short period of time, the focus went off the injustice and the harm and the death of George Floyd to the burning of buildings. And I was following the internet, and even some of my dear good, you know, one of the things that this whole racial experience has been doing is that it has been helping us get a better understanding of a better understanding of ourselves and of some of our friends. Let me, a second. Yeah, that I have friends who I'm just amazed that, you know, who they are. It's almost a couple of times I thought to myself and I said, I know this person. How could they be saying that? And I was watching how, I call it displacement. So I'm talking about a Black man who the world felt it was all right. And this is, I think, some of the deeper spiritual issues, that these 4 white men thought that it was all right to do that. Okay. That it was,
and one of them was Asian, Dr. Harris.
yes.
It was Asian, and he was the brother-in-law of the one with the knee on.
Yeah.
And the one with the knee on was married to an Asian woman,
Yeah.
who, by the way, left him immediately once this hit the fan. But that's
Yeah.
an interesting connection as well.
Well, you know, I'm going to do a quick aside. When I was a kid, I grew up in the segregated South. And one of the things, 3 things I wanted to do when I left North Carolina. I wanted to get pizza, I wanted to get yogurt, and I wanted to get Chinese food. So why would you want to do that? Because the Chinese came here from China, set up restaurants, and they adopted the same racist practices of the white people. So as a Black child, I couldn't go get Chinese restaurants, go get Chinese food. On television, I saw white people eating yogurt. That was not a part of the Black diet. So I couldn't wait to get some yogurt. When I didn't know it came in flavors, so I got plain yogurt and it was terrible. Okay. But I just say that as an aside, that you were saying something very deep, Doc. You were saying that the slave master mentality, the mentality of the enslaver, that mentality is still there. And so when situations happen like George Floyd, they find ways to deflect, to maintain that slave master mentality. So rather than be completely repulsed that somebody would kneel on a person's neck for over 8 minutes and watch him die, feel him die, they'll focus on, oh, they're burning buildings, they're throwing rocks, they're doing this. And so that slave master mindset, it really demonstrates that to resolve the race issue is going to take both white people having a new mental mindset and Black people. So a lot of what Tammy was sharing makes a lot of sense, that Black people are going to have to do some self-assessments and look at some of the things about ourselves that we need to work on. White people are going to have to do some self-assessments to look at some of the things about themselves that they got to work on. And then we got to really come to a common understanding as human beings. Back to you, Doc.
I'll ask Miss David her response to the conversation, and we'll continue from there.
I just admired everyone's opinion and listening truly. And the slave master mindset, you know, it's interesting because Dr. Harris, how you said it, I haven't not only seen white people with that mindset, but I have seen people who aren't Black with that mindset, who do not want to fall into the cracks of being considered a minority. So they rather be white superiority. And in terms of like Asian Americans, just because of the fact that they are lighter and they rather fall into that bracket of being white and having that superiority. So I found that very interesting because that is true. And I believe that hopefully within this generation that ends, because I feel like during 2020, with the things that happened during George Floyd's movement, it was eye-opening to see the people around you who you were surrounded by every day and their comments on Facebook or on Instagram, either being for you or against you. So I believe that was very eye-opening for me. And the hopeful part of me wants to believe that what happened over the summer in 2020 is making my generation more aware and woke, which I feel like has happened half and half, but I also feel like we've taken some steps back, especially with what happened during the Capitol riot. But yes, that's what I have to say about that.
Ms. Hunt, would you care to respond?
2020 was just too much. If I can say it in such a manner, with the deaths of people, innocent people, just people dying needlessly, injustice all over the place, the administration, just all the fights that we have to have. And then to come into the 21st year of the 20th century with COVID, which we brought from the 20th, from 2020, because we don't really know when it came in, to be very honest. I'd speculate and have my little theories that when Donald Trump returned from China, that it is he who released it into the air or brought it back in a package to some kind of laboratory, as HIV was, developed and moved forward. We know in Wuhan that next door to that animal market, that wet market, there a few blocks or next door, but not far away, is the laboratory where the virus was cultivated. So, we're living in a mystery. It's like being trapped in prison and thinking that you can, and knowing that you can go to the supermarket. You're like a trustee. We're like trustees. We're all in prison, but we're trustees. We're able to go to the supermarket. We're able to go and even get our hair done if we make an appointment in the right way. and the social distancing and all the rules that we have to adhere to. So I right now am not clear and very resistant to some of the things that are being suggested to us because it still comes under the White Supremacy Act, if you will. We're still being told what to do by those who have determined our fate.
Yeah.
We don't really have a say. We have a say. We have the right of refusal. But one of the things in that last administration was the dismantling of our rights, the dismantling of the Constitution and our Bill of Rights. So I'm suspect of anyone that wants to, make a suggestion about what I should do about my health, you know?
Understandable, totally understandable.
Tammy.
One
Yeah.
thing that we know, just if I may, Dr. Harris, one thing that we know, I'm not sure if the former president brought it back, but with the book that Robert Woodard came out with, it became clear that he knew about it much earlier than moving the government to take action on the COVID-19. I think they say he knew about it in October or November of 2018. I think that's it, Doctor. No, of 2019 before it came to us in 2020. And I hear you because yesterday, as you recall, we had a conversation about kind of the candle that lights other candles. And I think that the behavior of the person in the Oval Office in the past released the Kraken, and it released this, mentality that we saw play out in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, and with the Proud Boys and all around the country. So I think that it is an act of self-preservation to think critically about what we're being asked to do. And in doing that, I think that our conversations with the medical community and others speak to, in the midst of our oppression during enslavement, as Dr. Harris points out in the book, Solving the Race Issue, there was resistance. There were people who were having conversations that don't appear on the public record because we weren't keeping the public record. We weren't even counted in the census, during those times. So I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Harris, but I think what you said earlier is this is a very complex issue with a lot of arms and, elements to it.
It is so complex because, thank you both, Tammy and Doc and Danica. It is so complex that we often say, how do you eat an elephant? So an elephant weighs 4 or 5 tons. Can you eat an elephant? Not all at one time, but you can eat an elephant bite by bite. And so even a journey, the Chinese proverb, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And so when we at least acknowledge that there is a problem, that there is a challenge, I won't even call it a problem. It's a challenge. The difference between a problem and a challenge may not have an answer. I may not have a solution. A challenge, though, the mindset is if I have a challenge, I'm going to meet the challenge. Somehow I'm going to overcome. Somehow I'm going to be able to survive and thrive. And so if America is going to go forward, and I mean, countries don't die out. They rarely disappear off the planet. The Romans had a concept that when the Romans conquered a nation or a city, they had a term in Latin, it was lay waste. They said they laid waste the city. And said, well, what do you mean? Well, when it was translated, it meant that it was destroyed in such a way that it would appear as though it never was. And so if they conquered a town, they would kill all the inhabitants, keep the ones they wanted, burn the town down, bash it down, plow it underground, and then let the weeds overgrow it. So when you come along and you see this was the town of Nineveh, just for example, and all you see is weeds and overgrowth. And so when that idea of making it though it never was, I think America really had a great idea. When we keep talking about the idea that was America, the idea that all men are truly created equal, that all men are endowed with certain unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't know that anybody else has really said it like that. And the fact that there was an undertaking, and even though when we look at the founding fathers, they were so high on the elixir of slavery that they couldn't get by it. But they saw this, they saw the possibility. You know, it's like in the Bible says, I can see the promised land. I might not get there, but I know that there could be a world where all men are truly treated equally and all men are endowed with those inalienable rights. We just don't have all the tools to get there.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting it spot on. I think about last night on Chris Cuomo's show, he was talking about how Asian Americans are being brutalized around the country. Like they showed this image of an 89-year-old man going for his morning walk, and somebody just walked up on him and pushed him to the ground, and he bust his skull, and he died as a result of that. And so even as we, as African Americans, Black folks, Nubians, whatever the term is, we've seen this same slave mentality treatment toward the people who were here first, the indigenous Native Americans, that's the language we use, but the different ethnic groups, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the various indigenous. And then we saw when the Japanese internments, when they took Japanese Americans in America and they put them in internment camps. So this mentality, this slave makers mentality is in part the enemy. It's almost like the enemy you can't see is the mindset that people are walking around with. And again, I pay tribute to the book you've written and to all of us, Ms. Hunt, Ms. David, all of our other readers for taking the time to read it and to unpack it and to really wrestle with these various, issues for our better understanding, but for our counterparts to better understand what we've gone through and how it's affected them as much as how it's affected us. Ms. David, would you care to, I'm sorry, Ms. Hunt, Ms. David.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I just wanted to insert where you were talking about the entrapment and caging of people. We have some children in Texas that I'm very concerned about, these Latin American babies that were snatched from their parents at the borders. Suddenly, I've heard nothing. I'm looking for new information. Nobody's speaking about how we're going to take care of these children, because we went through this with the snatching of young African American boys and men for the interferon period during the HE hype. And that interferon was a very large component in the medications for sustaining the lives of people affected by HIV and AIDS. And it costs money to get interferon. And if you don't have any, then you won't live. So we have very few Magic Johnsons. We have some other people who are sustaining and living. They just don't talk about it so publicly as he. And probably his promise was that he would talk about it and be talked about. So the privacy clause was eliminated. But I say that we're talking about justice. So where's the peace? Now we haven't stepped on the peace clause. And how do we find peace, solidarity, and unity among us as a unit? We come in many descriptions, from octoroons to coal Black people who don't want to admit that they're Black, even though they're blacker than coal dust. So we suffer that with Africans who don't have any respect for us. There are some that do, I suppose, but they don't take us seriously because we don't take ourselves seriously. They don't see us reaching back and taking our education into the communities, planting trees, scrubbing steps, whatever it takes. We go back to the water. I live in Baltimore, Maryland. And we have a large, in this city, a large economic payout for lead. However, they have cut those funds, but there's still these affected people. And what nobody's looking at is that these affected children become adults with the same problems.
Yes,
And the mental health issue is what will solve all of our problems, because we all have post-traumatic stress from some degree.
we have been traumatized. We are engaged in stacked trauma in lieu of George Floyd and COVID and these elements
Long
that you're
before.
mentioning. And it's
Long
time for our
before Trayvon
psychologists to
Martin.
step up and offer solutions, and for us to do as we're doing on this call, turn to each other for healing, because part of the healing is talking about the pain. I don't like talking about pain. I recognize a part of the text that
either.
we're reading, but that also has a cathartic nature to it, particularly as we hear, voices like yours, Ms. Hunt and Ms. David and the authors, and we are able to lay some balm, some healing balm on top of these really open sores. They're still here. Ms. David, would you care to have a closing word as we prepare to close out today?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rogers and Dr. Harris and Ms. Hunt. Made good points, and I feel like America.
And I'm sorry, could everyone just mute other than Ms. David so we can hear you without an echo? Thank you.
Okay. I feel like we have taken steps forward, but have taken steps back at the same time. And it is going to take a lot for us, for where we are right now, to change, so that we can be seen as the Black African Americans we want to be portrayed as in America. I remember when Elder Cleveland was on here, he said, we don't want to call ourselves minority because that puts us in a lower view, but because we truly are the majority. But why aren't we getting treated as that? So that is what I feel like the Black community is heading towards. And that's why I truly believe that white supremacists are afraid of us. That's why they're racist, because they fear the power that we have. I mean, our ancestors were amazing people, but this generation and this time right now is clapping back harder. We are not going to allow it to happen. We have gone through so much trauma, and unfortunately there will still be times in history where it'll repeat itself. But I believe truly that there will come a time where we'll eventually will have to, I don't want to say come to agreement, but there will be a time in history where all of this trauma will hopefully be history. If that makes sense.
Unmic myself. Thank you so much, Danica. Thank you so much, Tammy. We've had just a powerful discussion today. As Dr. Rogers was saying, when we start talking about the nitty gritty of how all of this has come together, it can be very painful, and it's very revealing, as we interact with our Black and white counterparts. It's very revealing how so many of us retreat into, I'll call it a benign ignorance, just not wanting to know, because there's some things that are just so painful that if you know them, they hurt, and you say, I'd rather not know that. And so when you have that type of situation happening, then it's these type of discussions that help us go forward. As long as people want to know, it can get better. As long as people are open and listen to other folks. Sometimes we can be so excited about what we have to say, but as long as people can listen to other people, then we have a chance to create that more perfect union. America is always a work in progress, but the interesting thing is there's always a choice. We all have a choice for how we go forth together, and it has to be based on truth. And we have to go back to spiritual principles. I think are so profound. something you said earlier, Dr. Rogers. We call it we often talk about the Trinity when we talk about the Father, Son, Holy Ghost. But there's a Trinity that really fuels much of what goes on in the world, and it's the Trinity of power, profit, and pleasure. And so slavery was really an economic endeavor. When we talk about Abraham Lincoln, there was a nice piece done on him, and morally, he really was not against slavery. And deep inside, he really didn't believe that the races should mix, should come together. He thought that the Black folks should go somewhere else and set up their own stuff. Okay? He was also concerned that the South might become too powerful because it had free labor. And when they started the different compromises where you let in a free state. But what is the moral condition when you consider and say, well, when the politicians, the leaders say, well, we let in a free state where all men are created equal, and then for every free state, we'll let in a slave state where all men are created unequal. What is the moral contradiction there? And so all of this keeps going back to that moral contradiction. And the final solution has got to be a spiritual one, because anything other than spirit will not lead us where we need to go. We've gone a little bit over. Thank you so much, Tammy and Danica, Dr. Rogers. This has just been another day that we have scratched the surface of what it takes to solve racism in America. Thanks so much to our attendees. And we're going to now complete the broadcast that we have on Facebook and on Instagram. Thanking each and every one of you for being there. And please register for the webinar itself. It's great watching it on Instagram and on Facebook, but go to thebigread.net. And when you do that, you'll get a free ebook version of Solving the Race Issue in America. So go there and register. That way you can be a part of the discussion. That's www.thebigread.net. And we're going to close out is there anything we need to do before we close out the live broadcast? Doc, we're good?
Nope, just thank you, Ms. David and Ms. Hunt. And we appreciate you being here, and your contributions are literally invaluable. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let me close those out, and then we can open the lines for some comments from our guests, our participants.